Let's get started. So, last class, we finished by getting started on psychopathy, also known as antisocial personality disorder. So, we still have a decent amount left to talk about with regard to that. And then we'll do borderline, and then we'll close off with a few developmental disorders. So, almost done chapter 16, and then we'll get started on the final chapter. So with regard to psychopathy, in addition to the DSM-5, there's actually a separate validated scale called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. The world authority on psychopathy is a guy at UBC named Robert Hare, and this is a scale that he made. The way it works is there's 20 items. You don't need to know this for the test, but these will help give you a sense of the kinds of symptoms that they tend to have, or the kinds of behaviors they tend to show. So 20 symptoms. Each of them, someone can be either 0, 1, or 2. So obviously 0, not at all. 1, kind of, and 2, definitely. And so these are the kinds of symptoms you get. So just a representative list of pathological lying. They're very good liars. They have an absence of guilt or remorse. One of them is the antisocial aspect, so that's especially relevant. So things like early criminal behavior, early behavior problems. Psychopathy tends to emerge early in life, although if you're a kid, they call it conduct disorder. So they'll do things like torture animals and things like that at a very early age. So that's it. To give you a sense of what's going on. The cutoff that's standardly used as a matter of convention is 30 out of 40. There's 20 items, each can be 0, 1, or 2. By convention, if you're over 30, you're a psychopath. This is often used in prisons when you're making a decision about whether to release someone. This is a very good predictor of whether the person will commit crimes again. I had a professor who had to use this. He worked in a prison and had to interview sex offenders, so some seriously bad dudes, and he tried to figure out whether they were a psychopath or not. You'll see item 2 is grandiose sense of self-worth. One story he told, he was interviewing someone who had been in and out of prison his entire life, had never graduated high school, never really held down a serious job. And as part of the interview process, he asked, "What do you think you'll do if you're released from prison?" And without skipping a beat, the man said, "I'm going to be a doctor." So definitely would qualify for that one. So last class I used the example of Ted Bundy and serial killers like that. Those would be good examples. But psychopaths are around 1% of the population. Obviously, only a small percentage of those are serial killers. Psychopaths often do well in other areas. You know, they rise up in business or politics. I didn't say any names, but my professor also said that he believed that psychopaths would make very good surgeons. Because if getting used to being a surgeon is very difficult because it's a very nerve-wracking thing to do. Not a psychopath. They just go do their job and go home. Don't have to deal with getting nervous while doing it. So those are some of the symptoms involved. Now, what causes psychopathy? So the book has a discussion of different causal factors. Like everything we've seen so far, it is substantially heritable, so there is a genetic component to it. And in this case, unlike some of the other disorders, there's actually a specific gene that's been located. Now, this is not the psychopathy gene, it's just one gene that increases your risk. Its name is the MAOA gene. There's a specific variant which is associated with risk for psychopathy. And this is not just one study. There's a recent large meta-analysis that confirms that this is associated with increased risk for psychopathy. But more specifically, it's a case where there is a well-documented gene-environment interaction. The way it works out is, if you have the risky variant of this gene, but you do not suffer childhood abuse or trauma, you are not very likely to be a psychopath or to have a tendency towards antisocial behavior. If you have a traumatic or abusive childhood but don't have the genetic risk, you are also not very likely to become a psychopath. Where the risk is very high is if you have both. If you have both this gene and a traumatic or abusive childhood. As I said, this disorder tends to emerge early in life, and there are a number of telltale signs. So one that I already mentioned is cruelty to animals. That's one warning sign. Kids at risk for psychopathy generally do not get nervous, and neither do adults. This is why lie detectors do not work on psychopaths. There's a case of an American serial killer, not Ted Bundy, but a different one, who was an early suspect. He was brought into the police station and given a lie detector test, passed with flying colors, because what lie detector tests basically measure is nervousness when you're answering questions, and they don't get nervous, so it doesn't pick up on them lying. The same is true with kids. As a result, they generally do not respond well to punishment. Punishment has much less of an effect as far as decreasing problem behavior. As far as a neurological basis, the main regions that have been studied are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So recall the amygdala is an emotion center of the brain. Amygdala seems to be less active in psychopaths. This is involved in fear responses, so there could be something going on there. And of course, the frontal lobes are involved in self-control, controlling impulses. Excuse me. Given that this is extremely heritable, you may wonder, as with the other disorders, how do genes which predispose people to this set of behaviors, how do they evolve? How do they not just get selected against by evolution? I don't remember if this is in the key terms. If it's not in the key terms, don't worry about it. I don't think it is. But there's a lot of work on what's called frequency-dependent selection. The idea here is there are some traits that can be selected for so long as they remain sufficiently rare. This relates to something we talked about in 104, which is the evolution of altruism and cooperation. Humans and some of our mammalian relatives are very cooperative species. This is a long-standing problem in evolutionary biology because if you look at a species at a first glance and just think about it in simple Darwinian terms, it's very strange that self-sacrifice or compassion or cooperation would evolve, because evolution works by maximizing tendencies that get your genes into the next generation. And helping some random guy, like why would that get selected for? And one of the leading theories of this is reciprocal altruism, which is the idea, and again, you won't be tested on this, but the idea is that cooperative and altruistic tendencies can evolve as long as the situation is such that when I do something nice for someone, they do something nice for me in the future. So there's kind of a cooperative alliance that forms as a result. But crucially, in order for that to evolve, you have to be able to tell when someone is cheating, when they are taking your help but not helping you in the future. Because if that's the case, then niceness can't evolve. The nasty guy who takes the help but then doesn't help me back, he's going to spread his genes more than me in the long run. So in every species that has altruism towards non-kin, there's also cheater detection, right? The capacity to see, to remember people and remember if you've helped them and they are not returning the favor. But the cheaters, the people who receive help but don't help others, can persist if they're really good at it and sufficiently rare. And some have said that's basically what psychopaths are. They're people who kind of game the system, take advantage of people, are cruel and manipulative, and as long as they are sufficiently rare, they can persist over the generations. So I don't believe that's in the key terms, but that may be of interest to some people. I believe I mentioned this in the personality chapter. This is one of the disorders with the largest sex differences. It probably has something to do with the difference in agreeableness, where remember, the difference is not that big, but if you go to the extremes, the very, very disagreeable people are almost exclusively men. So when it comes to psychopathy or antisocial personality, around 90%. Could have something to do with this. You can think of it like height, right? So there's a sex difference in height where men are taller. Obviously, there's lots of overlap, but where the difference is especially large is the extremes. If you go to the very, very tall people, almost all men. The same is true for psychopathy when it comes to very, very disagreeable people. Okay, that's all I have to say about psychopathy. Any questions? Okay, next is borderline disorder, borderline personality disorder, sometimes called BPD. This one is extreme emotion dysregulation, extreme emotional instability. It's not just that, but that's probably the central symptom. It also is associated with hostility and various other symptoms. These people will this is closer to what some people think bipolar is. Some people think bipolar means your mood changes constantly throughout the day. Bipolar is not that. Borderline is at least in part that. These people will do things like, say they're in love with you one minute and then, verbally abuse you the next minute. They'll threaten to kill themselves to get you to do what they want. Dating people with this is obviously an experience, let's call it. Psychopathy is too, of course. Now, some people enjoy a little bit of chaos, but be careful out there, guys. This is all I'll say. So my brother has much less tolerance for craziness than I do, and he dated someone who we're pretty sure had this. It was quite the. I won't go into all the details, but hopefully she doesn't watch this. I don't want my house to burn down, but. My brother's problem, and hopefully he doesn't see this either, but is he's still very Christian and has I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. He has a very guilty conscience. So he felt like, oh, since I have done certain things, I have to marry her now. And I was pleading with him, don't do it, run for the hills. But anyways, I should probably stop talking before I get in trouble. Okay, where was I? Did you say crybaby?
No, you're crying.
Oh, yeah. No, literally, yeah. I thought you were calling my brother a crybaby. Anyways, I should probably move along. So, as far as causal variables that undergird borderline disorder, one is splitting, which the book talks about. This is an inability to integrate the good and bad features of a person. So, they do something good and they think, wow, this person's amazing, they're so great. They do something bad and they become furious. They are unable to integrate a person and think, no, other people will have some good traits and some bad traits. Okay. The book's discussion of borderline is shorter. Any questions about that disorder? Yes?
Basically, whenever something happens, they just go to the extreme.
They go to the extreme, yes. Like psychopathies, this one also has a sex difference. This one has a larger percentage of women. It's not quite as extreme as the psychopathy case, but it also does have a sex difference. Okay. The last category of the chapter is developmental disorders, or as the book calls them, disorders of childhood and old age. These are disorders that tend to emerge at specific developmental periods, in specific developmental windows. And the first one is ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As the name suggests, this is characterized by short attention spans, so difficulty paying attention in school or in other circumstances, and heightened energy, so more wild and energetic. There are many who argue that this condition is overdiagnosed. The book says perhaps 7 to 10% of American children are diagnosed with this. One anecdote I have, I was once a camp counselor. I was in charge of a cabin of, I think they were aged 10 through 12 boys, and a majority of the kids I was dealing with were diagnosed as ADHD. Now, a couple of the kids had serious problems, but some of them were just, whatever, they're 10-year-old boys. Yeah, they were energetic, but I mean, I was a 10-year-old boy once. I mean, if you guys have any younger siblings, your 10-year-old boys are kind of energetic. One thing that happened when I was dealing with them, so they were on the second floor of this cabin. I went to go to the washroom or something. I come back, the window's open, and a kid whose name I shouldn't say was not there. And I was like, where's such and such? They point to the open window. I stick my head out. He's sprawling along the side of the building on the second floor. And I was like, get back here, right? He's like, no, I can do it. I'm like, I like keeping my job here, so. The next one is autism spectrum disorder, sometimes just called autism. This used to be divided into two conditions. Actually, I'll say that in a second, but this is a cluster of symptoms that tend to go together. The central ones have to do with social difficulty. So, difficulty reading social cues, difficulty learning from people, difficulty maintaining eye contact. Less interest in people. When they're kids, they will often obsess over their favorite thing. When they're older, they may have obsessive and singular interests. And they also often engage in repetitive behavior, which can also be associated with rigidity in following schedules. They get very upset if their schedules are violated. So as I say, this used to be divided into two things, autism and Asperger's, where if you had the set of symptoms but you were high functioning, so you had normal or above average IQ, you were diagnosed as Asperger's, but now they just have it as one thing, autism spectrum disorder, where there's a whole range of functioning that you can have. So some people, many people with autism have below average IQs or even an intellectual disability. Some have normal range IQ, and as I'm sure many of you know, some of them are extremely intelligent. You see a lot of people with similar sets of symptoms in academia. Academia is a great place for people with this set of symptoms because you can get really obsessively interested in one thing. You know, that's basically what you're supposed to do as a PhD student. There's a story about Noam Chomsky, who we talked about back in the language chapter. So he didn't know what autism was, and someone was explaining it to him, and Chomsky said, can you say more about what autism looks like? and he said, oh, Mr. Chomsky, you're in the philosophy department, right? Yes. Just go up and down the halls of the professors there. About half of them will have autism. So, as someone with a master's in philosophy, there might be some truth to that. Now I was unsure about showing this, but there's one character on television who perfectly exemplifies these symptoms. I already heard someone say it, so Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory. Now I hesitated because there is a laugh track in the background. Look, Sheldon is a national treasure. I'm not, poking fun at him, but he really does show these symptoms very well. Like I say, national treasure and a genius. Okay, one other condition that's related to autism is savant syndrome. So these are people who typically have autism, but in addition, they have one extreme ability. They're not necessarily high IQ overall, but they may be extremely good at mathematical calculation or have an extremely good memory. And it's sometimes surprising because when you see them and talk to them, they may seem like they have some kind of intellectual disability, but then they'll have one freakishly good ability. I have another clip of this, which is the movie Rain Man. It's an older movie. Have any of you seen Rain Man? So, to cut a long story short, Tom Cruise, who plays the main character, is with his brother, who he assumes has an intellectual disability, but then he discovers that he in fact is a savant. Okay, so that's a really nice example of savant syndrome. It's not the only kind of ability they can have, but that's one example. I want to be clear, it's not the case that all people with autism will have this. This is a small subset. Sometimes people say, oh, you're autistic, what's your special ability? That doesn't necessarily follow, but there are a subset called savants who do have this. Okay, so as far as causal factors, this one is also heritable, and this one is quite high as far as heritability estimates go. I've seen estimates in the 80 to 90% range, so quite strongly genetically influenced. One of the bases may be, well, we know this is associated with autism, is impairments in the theory of mind system. So the ability to understand that other people have different minds than you. So remember back in the developmental chapter, there are various tests that you can give of theory of mind. Children with autism consistently do worse on those kinds of tests. Right, like the one where you show the kid the box that's labeled Smarties, but there's actually pens inside. The kid thinks first he thinks they're Smarties, then you show him that there's pens, close it up, a new kid comes in, and you say, hey, what do you think that new kid thinks is inside the box? And the right answer is Smarties, because this kid hasn't seen the reveal that there's actually pens. But kids who are young will say pens. They'll say, yeah, the kid thinks there's pens in there. Kids around the age of 4 or 5 are able to pass this test, but kids with autism tend to continue to perform badly on these kinds of tests. There was an idea out there, which was put forward by a British doctor in a study that was later retracted for fraud, that vaccines, specifically the MMR vaccine, causes autism. And I really can't do any better than this one website as far as responding to that idea. This is www.howdovaccinescauseautism.com. And and then there's a link to a meta-analysis by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And then you can donate a beer to enjoy the site. Why not buy me a beer? And then there's options to buy him a beer. So, work hard. Okay. Any questions on autism or ADHD? Okay. The last disorder is dementia, which is an umbrella of disorders that occur in old age. So these tend to emerge in childhood. This one emerges in old age. The most famous type of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. When I was a kid, I thought it was old-timers. I misheard it, but Alzheimer's disease. So dementia in general, as a diagnosis, involves deterioration of cognitive capacities, especially memory. All right, so my grandfather had this. He had Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is one particular cause of dementia. It is characterized by a set of biomarkers. They're listed in the key terms. I'll show you what they look like. I won't test you on what they look like, but just to give you an idea. Amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Sometimes you have to wait for an autopsy before you can confirm that it was Alzheimer's, but this is the specific, these are specific biomarkers for it. This is what the neurons of someone with Alzheimer's will look like. And the condition leads to significant brain atrophy. So if you compare these two brains, one is healthy and one is advanced Alzheimer's, and as you can see, there is significant brain atrophy. In particular, right around here is where the hippocampus is, and this very significant section of atrophy is where most of the hippocampus would have been. Those of you who are in 104 will remember that the hippocampus is very important for creating and accessing long-term memories, so that makes sense. Okay, and that's it for chapter 16. Any questions? Yeah.
What's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia?
Dementia is the umbrella. So you can have dementia without Alzheimer's. There's other possible causes. So dementia is any significant memory and cognitive decline in old age. Alzheimer's is one specific kind with specific neural markers. Yeah.
Is dementia specifically old age, or does CTE fall into that part?
I believe it by definition has to be a result of old age. I'm pretty sure CTE would be considered a separate diagnosis. I won't test you on the difference, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Any other questions? All right, so we will now start the final chapter of introductory psychology, which is treatment of psychological disorders. And I'm going to start, I've taken this from the book, but I've actually added a few things. So this version will be in the PowerPoint notes. So I encourage you to use this one when you're organizing your study. So there's different ways of cutting them up. One that I should have included is you can divide them between biological and all the others. So biological, so drugs, electroconvulsive therapy, and other things, those are treatments that involve a direct biological intervention, so a physical mode of treatment. And then all the others involve some kind of talk or action. So you actually go to an office, sit down with a therapist, and say or do something. I guess I could have added that, but that's one distinction. The other distinction is the one between insight therapies and symptom-oriented therapies. This is often made in psychology textbooks. It's not a sharp distinction, but the idea is with the insight therapies, one of the primary goals is for people to achieve insight into their condition, to get at the deep internal causes of the problem. With the others, the goal is to just address the symptoms. So we're not going to talk about your childhood or your unconscious or other weird stuff like that. If you're sad, we're going to try to make you less sad. If you have ADHD, we're going to try to improve your ability to pay attention. As I said, the line is not super sharp. Cognitive may have some elements of insight, but this is the way that many textbooks will draw a distinction. So we will start, so we'll go in from left to right. We'll start with psychodynamic types of therapy. So psychodynamic is an umbrella, and it includes various Freudian and neo-Freudian approaches. The one that the book spends the most time on is the original type of psychodynamic therapy, which is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis being Freud's therapeutic technique. So I'm sure this looks familiar to many of you from movies and TV shows. This is often how therapy is presented, where someone is lying on a couch and there's a therapist taking notes. That is very rare nowadays. You will have to look pretty far to find a psychoanalyst who does that. Most types of therapy today involve two chairs, face-to-face, not this. Though, as I say, it is very popular in the movies. So, as I said earlier, one goal of psychoanalytic therapy is insight. And for an analyst, it's insight into the unconscious causes of your problems. So for Freud, as we saw in chapter 16, the origin of many of our problems is neurotic anxiety, right? Internal, unconscious conflict. And for Freud, it's very important that you get to the root of the problem. You get to the unconscious conflict. If you don't deal with the underlying unconscious issue, he argued that symptom substitution will occur. So this would be Freud's critique of the various symptom-oriented therapies. So let's say someone has an anger problem, a very serious anger problem. So for Freud, that's going to be caused by something in the unconscious. If you just target the anger, but not the unconscious conflict, the person won't be angry anymore, but then they'll get depressed. That'll be their new symptom, because you haven't dealt with the underlying issue. And if you deal with that, they'll develop a drug problem, whatever. So you have to deal with the unconscious conflict. So how do you get at the unconscious? There are different methods. One that I won't test you on, that I'll just mention in passing. Freud used hypnosis. Again, I don't think I listed that in the key terms, so don't worry about it, but that was one way that he would get at unconscious, repressed memories. This is a very controversial aspect of his therapeutic technique, but he did sometimes use hypnosis. Another more well-known one is free association. Sometimes see this in the movies. So with free association, the main version of it is the client or patient will lie on the couch, look up and just talk out loud, and you're supposed to just talk freely, not hold anything back, and just let your mind wander in front of the therapist. And then the therapist or the analyst will take notes. It's all free associate. So, the lights are on here. That reminds me of when I was a kid, that first time of summer when the sun's really bright, it's kind of hard on your eyes, you have to adjust. I remember that one summer, and you just keep going. And you're supposed to not hold anything back. Just say whatever comes to your mind. And then the analyst will try to uncover patterns in what you say, which provide him or her data to infer what's going on in the unconscious. Another method is dream analysis. We talked about this in 104. So Freud thought that dreams had two sets of content. The manifest content and the latent content. Freud believed that during dreams, our tendency to engage in defense mechanisms and repression was decreased. We are not as, or I should say the ego is not as capable of repressing things from the unconscious, but it still does it a little bit. So repressed ideas come up, they bubble up during dreams, but they are only able to bubble up symbolically. You never dream exactly about the thing you unconsciously want or unconsciously worried about. It only comes up symbolically. So the manifest content is what literally happens in the dream. So I have a dream that, I don't know, I'm running through the woods, I get attacked by the bear, and then I kill the bear, and then my skin turns red, and I eat a pizza. I don't know, I just made that up. So that's the manifest content. It's what literally happens in the dream. The latent content is the hidden symbolic meaning. So it represents whatever repressed sexual desires, conflicts between you and your parents you don't want to acknowledge, whatever, craziness. And it's up to the analyst to infer what the hidden symbolic meaning is. And there are manuals for doing this. I'm not an expert on it, but that's how dream analysis works. Throughout all of this, one thing that the analyst will be looking for is resistance. If at any point the patient does not want to talk about something, or if they start talking about it and go, I'm not sure I want to go there, that is viewed as very important. It's viewed as evidence of repression or some related issue. And the analyst will try to press into that topic. This is very different from how Carl Rogers does therapy, as we'll see later. With Rogers, if you don't want to talk about something, then they just won't talk about it. That's one key difference. And then the last feature is transference. This is where the patient has a certain emotional attitude towards someone in their life, and they will project that attitude onto the analyst. So let's say I'm really mad at my dad because I had this lifelong dream of being in ballet, and he wouldn't let me. I don't actually know. And I'm really mad at my dad as a result. And I go to an analyst, and I get mad at him for being too controlling, not letting me talk about what I want to talk about. And he'll say, you're really mad at your father, but you've transferred this attitude onto me, or something like that. I do actually have a funny story about that. I was never in dance or anything, but I was an acting kid in high school, and I was Puck. How many of you know Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream? So I committed to the role, because I don't half-ass roles. So Puck is a fairy, and when I entered on stage, I would twirl on stage. And my dad did see the show, and afterwards, it just, in my family culture, we make fun of each other. That's how it goes. So in the car ride home, you're a little flamboyant up there. Anyways, okay, so that's all the stuff you need to know for psychoanalysis. It was surprisingly hard to find a video of psychoanalysis. There are a lot of movie clips of it, but none of them really did what I wanted. But I finally found a good one. So I have a video that shows, it's not a real session, but it's based on a real session. And it illustrates a number of these concepts. Okay, so that's a good representation of a number of those concepts. We'll talk later about the efficacy of different types of therapy, but one downside of psychoanalysis that I think everyone agrees on, although the people who are psychoanalysts would say it isn't a downside, is it takes a long time. In fact, according to Freud, your analysis is never complete. But in a world where nothing is free, this can be a downside. So there is a growing movement to have what are called brief psychodynamic therapies. So therapeutic techniques to take some of the ideas from Freud, but make them more condensed and therefore affordable. One example the book gives is interpersonal therapy. So remember from chapter 12 that a lot of the work on attachment grows out of the Freudian tradition. So you can think of this as sort of attachment or relationship-based therapy. So that's one example of brief psychodynamic therapy. Okay. The next type of therapy is humanistic therapy, which is an umbrella that includes a couple types, but the main type is the kind developed by Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, who we saw in the personality chapter, called his therapeutic technique client or person-centered therapy. And right off the bat, the name is important. So Freud would have called the people receiving treatment from him patients, which kind of presupposes that you're seriously messed up. But Rogers would call the people clients or just persons, just people. Consistent with this, there's no lying on the couch. You just sit face to face as equals, and the therapist's goal is not to impose a treatment plan or to tell you the way it is, but just to sit there and listen and guide you to discover for yourself what to do. So the term for this, one of the most important features of this therapeutic method, is that it is non-directive, which is just a way of saying the therapist does not tell you what will happen or how they should proceed. So as I said back in Freud, it's viewed as very significant if you don't want to talk about something. And that's a reason to talk even more about it. Not for Rogers. For Rogers, if you don't want to talk about something, then we won't talk about it. That's the way it works in this therapeutic technique. Some other features of the technique. One that we've already seen in the personality chapter is Rogers believed in the importance of unconditional positive regard. So that means you will accept or treat the person well no matter what they do, without conditions. Conditional would mean like I'll only accept you if you don't say anything crazy. Two that go together are empathy and active or reflective listening. So a very important part of humanistic, or in this case, client-centered therapy, is you just repeat back what you're hearing. You try to understand what the person's going through and repeat back what they say in your own words, the therapist's words. So if the client says, I just got fired and I feel really inadequate, I'm really worried about how my family views me, and I'm really scared about the future, Rogers would just say, well, it sounds like you're really worried about your recent unemployment and that you think your family may be viewing you negatively. Do I have that right? Yeah. So that's an example of just showing empathy and reflective listening. And the third is genuineness. This one could potentially be in conflict with unconditional positive regard. Genuineness means the therapist is completely honest and transparent with how they're feeling. If they are feeling negative, they are still to report that, but not in a way that interferes with unconditional positive regard. So you would say, I'm not happy with what you did here, but of course this is still a safe place, I still accept you, etc. So I used to think this was the way to go. When I first heard of this therapeutic technique, I thought it was really insightful to do things this way. This is part of course, being a good friend, right? If you're talking your friend through something, it's often important just to repeat back what you're hearing and to be empathetic. But in some meta-analyses, it comes out as one of the less effective techniques. Now, some meta-analyses find that they're almost all the same, as we'll see later, but I do know of some where this one comes out towards the bottom. And one problem you could point to is, look, I mean, if you have a good friend, or for that matter, a good parent, you'll get something like this, right? But presumably therapy should have something more than that. But these are all good things, of course, but one could argue that it's important to have something more than just, yeah, I see that you're going through a tough time. I used to have this great line I would always say here. I would say, if you want to help someone, don't try to help them, try to understand them. It's a good line, but I'm not sure that it's good enough on its own. Having said all that, in this case I have a video not of a psychoanalytic practitioner, but the actual Carl Rogers. I have a few videos today of different therapeutic techniques, so we'll see a number of these in action. As I say, this is the real Carl Rogers. Okay, so you get the idea. So his goal is just to understand what she's going through, to repeat back what he's hearing, and so on. Not to give an answer. Another type of therapy that is usually listed as a type of humanistic therapy is Gestalt therapy. In general, in your future classes, if you see the phrase humanistic therapy, you should assume it's talking about Rogers if you're not given extra information. But another type is Gestalt therapy. So remember back from perception, if you took 104, the Gestalt psychologist looked at how we are pattern seeking, how when we look at the world, we like to put things into groups or wholes or categories. And the Gestalt therapist extended this idea to our view of ourselves, that we have disparate sets of experiences and memories that are sometimes disjointed and that cause us anxiety. So their goal is to guide you in creating a narrative or sense of yourself that can unify the different experiences and memories that you have, to put it into a whole or a pattern. Another type of therapy that falls under this umbrella, it's not in the book, but I'll add it since it's probably the most famous other than Rogers, is existential therapy. And more specifically, a type of that which is logotherapy, which was put forward by Viktor Frankl. The goal of the existential types of therapy is to find meaning in the midst of suffering. This grows out of the philosophical tradition of existentialism. How many of you have heard of existentialism? Good. So the basic premise of existentialism is that life is meaningless and full of suffering, and that it's up to us to make our own meaning. And these therapeutic techniques grow out of that tradition. In the case of Viktor Frankl, he came to this insight while he was in a concentration camp. So he was a European Jew in the the 40s, and so he was in a concentration camp. He survived, but while he was there, he came to see the importance of finding suffering, even in this case, the worst possible situation you could be in. And he went on to develop what he called logotherapy. He has a famous quote that despair is suffering without meaning. So suffering is inevitable, but despair is when you have no story to tell yourself about it, or have no ability to make meaning out of it. There's a quote in the PowerPoint notes. I'll read a fuller version of it. This is a good summary of the core of logotherapy. As logotherapy teaches, even the tragic and negative aspects of life, such as unavoidable suffering, can be turned into a human achievement by the attitude which a man takes towards his predicament. Logotherapy may justly be called optimistic because it shows the patient how to transform despair into triumph. Avoiding suffering as much as possible is desirable. So meaning, look, if you can solve the problem, obviously that's preferable. But what about inescapable suffering? Logotherapy teaches that pain must be avoided as long as it is possible to avoid it. But as soon as a painful fate cannot be changed, it must not only be accepted, but must be transmuted into something meaningful, into an achievement. So that's the core of logotherapy. Any questions about the humanistic types of therapy? Okay, next is cognitive therapy, but I think we're ahead of where we need to be, so we'll start there on Thursday. See you all then.